An investigation by AM into child support payments has found tens of thousands of children are growing up going without. Just over 114,000 parents are liable to pay via IRD. 70% of those are paying something, although most of it is paid late. 30% of liable parents are not paying at all. So that is more than 34,000 liable parents. IRD has initiated legal action, a charging order against just one of them in the last year and the same number the year before. Family lawyer Lady Deborah Chambers KC and sole parent advocate Leanne Inder join us for more on this. Lady Deborah, if I can start with you, 30,000 parents not paying at all, consequences legally for just one of them in the last year. Is the system working?
Well, first of all, good morning. No, clearly it isn't. It wouldn't be by anyone's measure. It is not working. And that's particularly disappointing because one of the ideas behind the Child Support Act was that child support would be collected like a tax. And this was one of the ideas, that it would be simpler for custodial parents to get their money because IRD was collecting it. If 30% of taxpayers were not paying their tax, we'd see action on it. And it's very disappointing to see this level of non-compliance.
So they've changed a rule this year, I believe, whereby new parents who are liable, become liable for child support payments this year, their payments are taken directly from their salary, so it works more like a tax. Do you think that is going to fix the problem?
Well, they've always had the power of deduction, and deduction from any monies owed. So they've always had that power, and that is a great system for enforcing child support. It would be interesting to know why they are not using deductions across these people who haven't paid, and why there is still over $1 billion outstanding in child support. So that they've always had that power, and I think it's great that AM asked for this information and had a look at it under the covers. But there's more questions here. Why aren't they enforcing? I think some of it may be liable parents leaving New Zealand to go and live particularly in Australia. And I know that there isn't enough of an agreement between the two tax departments in Australia and New Zealand. There's some system where we agree to collect 20 Australian liable parents here and they agree 20. Well, it's not enough. But I think the answer there is to change they have the ability. I mean, this is a tax act, so they have a lot of ability to enforce, and they have the ability to get a warrant for arrest if you leave the country when you haven't paid child support. But they have to go through the courts. The courts are not really working. They're too slow. They're too cumbersome. The better approach would be that IRD, through administrative purposes, could say to Customs, don't let anyone in or out of the country if they haven't paid child support, and particularly these, and I'm talking particularly these people who deliberately avoid and they're off on a nice holiday to the Gold Coast, or the people that go and live in Australia. You cannot come back without being interviewed about what are you doing about your child support, mate? Why aren't you paying it? And we want a check now.
Surely wouldn't be a hard thing to do through Customs. Leanne, if I can come to you now, we're talking about parents who are not paying, but what is actually the impact on children who are not receiving?
Oh, look, it's significant. And look, you don't realise how bad the child support system is until you're actually part of it, either as a parent or a child as part of that system. We've been advocating for a number of years around trying to create some change around that child support system because, as Deborah outlines, look, it's just simply not working. We've got one of the highest rates of child poverty in the OECD. There is no doubt in my mind that actually this is linked to the outstanding financial support that children should be receiving and simply aren't. And look, the Act itself is really explicit about the obligations of both parents to meet the financial obligations of their children, and to do so without requiring necessarily the intervention of the courts. But we so often hear from the families that we work for and with that they're told by Inland Revenue, look, you can't guarantee receiving child support. It's not guaranteed, so you're just going to have to get on with it. It's simply not good enough.
Do you agree with Lady Deborah that more legal action or more follow-up action needs to be happening? Do you think that that's a downfall in the system?
Absolutely, and like Lady Deborah outlined, I'm just really at a loss as to why Inland Revenue is not using the powers that they have available to them. A lot of these families really do struggle to actually make ends meet, and in their role as administrators of the child support system, I believe it really is the responsibility of Inland Revenue to actually utilise all of those powers that have available in order to really send a message that supporting children in New Zealand is actually not a discretionary thing, that when you're a parent and you're responsible for those children, that you should be meeting your financial responsibilities.
Especially, so as you say, when we have issues with child poverty, and now it looks like 34,000 children at least are not receiving the support that they are entitled to from both parents.
Absolutely, and the hardship that those families experience when supporting children without actually getting the child support, it's just unconscionable, and it really does need to change.
Lady Deborah, though, is this tough in this economic environment to say to a parent, you owe this money and you have to pay? I mean, there are a lot of families who are really struggling with those payments. You know, do you think that cracking down on parents who might not necessarily, not talking about the ones who, you know, you mentioned going to the Gold Coast on a nice holiday, but the parents who can't afford it, cracking down on them legally, is that the right thing to do?
Well, I think there's a number of answers to that. First of all, the legislation does provide for IRD in hardship cases to look at it again. And you know, terrible things happen to people and things go wrong and suddenly you're not in a position to pay your child support. I understand that, but I suspect that's quite a small group of these people. The second point is that the formula itself, in terms of your liability for child support, allows for a living allowance before you even have to pay child support. So there is allowance for that. And the third point is that we know from the cases where it is litigated that there is a group of New Zealanders who take the view that they will do anything possible to avoid their child support obligations. They'll transfer property into other people's names. They'll, particularly if they're self-employed, they'll minimise their taxable income. You know, and I say to those people, well, your first obligation is to support your children. If you have a child, that's number one. Other people might say no, wine is number one, but I say children are number one, and I really think, and the legislation says that. It has, as Leanne said, it has clauses in it which says these charging orders take priority over everything else. So the legislation is clear. I think there needs to be a change of attitude. I'd like to see liable parents accept that if they have children, they need to contribute towards the payment and not try and worm their way out. Even if they go and live in Australia, they'd send money back. And I'd like to also see, I think the other remedy for the women and men that Leanne's looking after is to see the obligation, to see it come out of the court system completely so it becomes administrative by IRD, but with a right for the parent who's got issues with IRD to go to court. So we change the onus in terms of going to court on the person who isn't paying.
Family lawyer Lady Deborah Chambers KC and sole parent advocate Leanne Inder, appreciate you both being with us this morning. We also asked the IRD if we could interview someone on this, but they declined. It's 7:27.